One moment, please.
1, 2, 3, 4. Hello, NBC. Hello, NBC. This is KTU in Honolulu, Hawaii. I am speaking from the roof of the Advertiser Publishing Company building. We have witnessed this morning the distant view, a brief battle off Pearl Harbor, and a severe bombing of Pearl Harbor by enemy planes, undoubtedly Japanese. The city of Honolulu has also been attacked and considerable damage done. This battle has been going on for nearly 3 hours. One of the bombs dropped within 50 feet of KTU Tower. It is no joke, it is a real war.
Senators and representatives, I have the distinguished honor of presenting the President of the United States.
Mr. Vice President, Mr. Speaker, members of the Senate, of the House of Representatives, yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy, the United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan.
Well, thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for welcoming me back to the Naval War College. It is a distinct honor for me to return here, especially to commemorate such a significant event. There are few places where the history and heritage of the U.S. Navy resonates more than where we are at this moment. The great campaigns fought around the world since the college's founding in 1884, indelibly linked to the education of personnel on the wargaming boards and in the lecture halls here in Newport. You know, whenever I give a speech, I'm oftentimes reminded of how a Rear Admiral by the name of Austin Doyle used to do it. As Chief of Naval Air Reserve Training back in 1950, he used to travel the country most every other weekend, visiting what was then a multitude of reserve squadrons scattered around the country. His message to each was essentially the same, and so quickly he had his remarks down pat. But as his former aide once told me, it got to the point where he would stand at the podium and utter a few sentences, at which time he would, with great theatrics, rip up the prepared remarks and throw them aside and say, "I'm not going to give you some canned speech," which he would then proceed to do. So you will see no ripping of papers tonight. My speech is not canned, but I most certainly do not have it memorized. In thinking about my remarks this evening, I thought back to my previous visit here, a much warmer, for this Florida boy, June evening to commemorate the Battle of Midway. Upon arrival, I was very surprised to be put up in one of the old flag officer suites down at the bottom of the hill. And as I surveyed the surroundings, I stepped into an alcove with a great bay window overlooking the bay. And on the desk sat a large book with a slightly worn cover, which I soon discovered to be the guest book containing the signatures of those who had stayed there. The first signature, as I recall, was of the Secretary of the Navy and later U.S. Senator John Warner. So when I flipped through over 25 years worth of signatures and signed my name, it was special to think that for at least a few days, the first and last signatures in the book belonged to graduates of Washington and Lee University, though the significance of the last signature paled in comparison to that of the first. A few names down from Secretary Warner appeared the signature of author Herman Wouk, whose book, The Caine Mutiny, remains one of my favorites. Of course, he also penned 2 novels about a Navy family caught up in the events of World War II. Its patriarch, a character named Pug Henry. At the end of the first novel, Captain Henry arrives at Pearl Harbor in the aftermath of the attack to pay a visit to the USS California, of which he had been ordered to take command, the pinnacle of his Navy service up until that point. Luke wrote the following about Pug's thoughts upon seeing Battleship Row for that first time. He was a battleship man. Other battleship men might still find excuses for these tragic slaughtered dinosaurs that the launch was passing. For Pug Henry, facts governed. Each of these vessels was a giant engineering marvel, a floating colossus as cunningly put together as a lady's watch, capable of pulverizing a city. All true, all true. But if caught unawares, they could be knocked out by little tin flying crates. The evidence was before his eyes. The 20-year argument was over. In the book, Pug Henry's son, Warren, a naval aviator, lives with his wife and child in Hawaii. Not unlike a real-life couple, Lieutenant Edward Colstock and his wife, Jenny, who were stationed there while the lieutenant served at Naval Air Station Kaneohe Bay. On December 9, 1941, Jenny Colstock sat down to record for family members back home the momentous events that had occurred since the early morning hours of the previous Sunday. In this day and age, cell phone videos and text messages would have instantaneously captured the attack on Pearl Harbor. But 75 years ago, those separated from their loved ones by the vast stretch of the Pacific had to wait for detailed news. In neat penciled script, she recounted the ringing of the telephone, interrupting morning slumber, and their daughter telling them about a frantic voice on the other end of the line, saying, "My God, get him up. It's a matter of life and death." She told of seeing Japanese planes over Kaneohe and kissing her husband goodbye with the words, "I don't want you to go over there," and noting what a clever remark that was. Walking out the door, he responded, "I guess there will be a lot of things you don't want from now on." She went on to write about the trenches being dug in the front yard and about a frantic drive back to her home from the base when a false alarm of an air attack occurred. And then she wrote about the reassuring voice of FDR coming over the airwaves. Whether in fact or as portrayed in fiction, the immediacy of the changes wrought by the attack on Pearl Harbor is undeniable. A moment in time when a convergence of forces transformed lives. It also shaped the destinies of countries, where national expectations and strategies converged with realities of modern warfare, ultimately shaping a new world order with impacts still felt to this very day. Such was the historical crossroads that converged at Hawaii. The events of December 7th are ripe with symbolism when it comes to the evolution of naval warfare, particularly with respect to naval aviation. Never before had a carrier striking force of such power, 6 flat tops carrying over 350 aircraft, put to sea and transited such great distance to attack an enemy. The underway logistics of the endeavor, as impressive as the firepower capable of being launched from those carrier flight decks. It was a script long in the making on both sides of the Pacific. 37 years before, at another harbor fortress, Japanese destroyers had approached under the cover of darkness to attack an enemy at anchor. Like the Japanese aircraft carriers of 1941, the ships, with names like Aboro, Shiragumo, and Kasumi, represented a relatively new platform being introduced into the arsenals of the world's naval powers. The deadly torpedoes they carried, foreshadowing the ordnance destined to slam into the sides of the ships of Battleship Row. The action, which heavily damaged 3 Russian capital ships, drew interest in naval circles around the world, and newspaper headlines lauded the boldness and skill of the attack against an unsuspecting enemy. Such was the interest in the Russo-Japanese War that in June 1905, one young honeymooner en route to Europe on board a passenger liner would take time away from his bride, much to her consternation, to spend hours conversing with a pair of Japanese naval officers en route to England to take command of 2 ships being built there. His name was Franklin D. Roosevelt. During the previous months, other officers of the Japanese Navy had engaged the Russian fleet, and won a lopsided victory in the Tsushima Straits. Among them, a recent graduate of Etojima, the Japanese Naval Academy. His name was Isoroku Yamamoto. Actions of the likes of Port Arthur and Tsushima, just like that which occurred at Hampton Roads during the Civil War, prompted tactical evaluation and spurred technology. Among the latter was the introduction of the dreadnought by Great Britain in 1906, which inspired worldwide battleship construction, including in the United States, where Franklin D. Roosevelt, now Assistant Secretary of the Navy, attended the 1914 ceremony in which one of these battle wagons was christened with the name of a state, as was customary during that time. Her name was Arizona. That same year, a new facility, the first of its kind in the U.S. Navy, was opened in the Florida Panhandle. After an inspection of the site by FDR, it was called a Naval Aeronautics Station, and in its skies, the generations of naval aviators who would lead and fight World War II first learned their craft. Among them was a young U.S. Naval Academy graduate in the class of 1919, who, along with his classmates, graduated a year early because of World War I. Assigned to the battleship Texas, Ensign Logan C. Ramsey was aboard to witness the surrender of the German fleet on November 21st, 1918. Remaining in the crew of the battle wagon, he spent the winter of 1919 in Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, during which time Texas was one of two battleships fitted with a makeshift wooden deck from which surplus World War I Sopwith Campbells launched. Their purpose was to evaluate the utility of wheeled aircraft versus seaplanes in supporting operations at sea. These trials led to the decision to convert a collier named Jupiter into the U.S. Navy's first carrier, USS Langley, which was commissioned in March 1922. By that time, Ensign Ramsey had completed flight training and been designated Naval Aviator number 2,977, his flying career eventually taking him to that very deck of Langley and other interwar flat tops. And like other naval aviators of his generation, he championed the cause of naval air power and its potential for decisive application in naval warfare, sharing his opinions in the U.S. Naval Institute proceedings. One of his articles, published in August 1937, argued that while naval tacticians were beginning to understand the airplanes as an effective weapon in attacking ships at sea, scant attention had been paid to the threats to fleets in port. The quotes from his article, "Aerial attacks on fleets at anchor," are telling. Naturally, with the fleet in port, no major operations may be undertaken against the enemy, which in turn permits him to assume a certain strategical freedom of movement, Ramsey wrote. Further, the attack itself would occur at his chosen moment, rather than at a more indeterminate instant, such as might be expected as a result of unanticipated contact at sea. Under the most ideal conditions, he wrote, an aerial attack develops with such speed and may come from so many directions simultaneously that it may break through all static defense and seriously damage vital units of the fleet. The only sure defense is to tackle the ball carrier before he crosses the line of scrimmage. In other words, to stop the aerial attack before the planes are launched. He concluded any transoceanic aerial raid would be undertaken not with the purpose of destroying our cities and factories, but in the hope and expectation of inflicting damage upon our fleet while it is in port. Such a long-distance operation would involve great risk of loss to the enemy of the entire raiding force, either before or after it made the attack, as the hazards in such an attempt would be enormous. Compensating damage upon our fleet could hardly be inflicted unless the maximum force available should be employed. To risk the complete loss of such a vital part of his fleet by using it in such an operation with any objective other than our fleet would constitute a strategical blunder unexcelled by any in naval history. Flash forward to the morning of December 7th, 1941, and now Lieutenant Commander Logan C. Ramsey was serving as Chief of Staff to Rear Admiral Patrick Bellinger, Commander of Patrol Wing 2 on Ford Island, when he watched the first Japanese dive bomber unleash its deadly ordnance. He immediately ordered the transmission of the famous flash message that stunned a Navy and a nation. Air raid Pearl Harbor. This is not drill. The conjecture of 1937 had become the reality of 1941. As the aircraft roared over the harbor, the early morning sun glinting off the red balls on their wings, explosions rumbled throughout the area, and the rattle of machine guns permeated the air. The sea breezes of peace now carried the pungent smell of burning oil. Lieutenant Commander Ramsey's 16-year-old daughter, Mary Ann, joined her mother and other civilians seeking shelter. A silver bracelet she was wearing hit by shrapnel as she made her way out of the house. Her jewelry and her high school yearbook, the sentimental items that she had grabbed in haste. Soon, a badly burned survivor of a battleship, his blue eyes luminescent against the black oil that covered his body, arrived at their shelter. She recalled that when I saw that first sailor, so horribly burned, personal fear left me. He brought to me the full tragedy of that day, drastically changing my outlook. At 16, the idea that any man could be the instrument of such desecration of another in so hideous a manner had been incomprehensible. I had read nothing in history books that could match the impact of those first 15 minutes in the shelter. My sense of values, my self-centered world had been shaken and changed forever. And as if to shed all elements of her pre-attack existence, she never wore that bracelet again. Lieutenant Commander Magruder H. Tuttle, who was serving as Officer of the Day on Ford Island, had been an All-American lineman at the Naval Academy and certainly relished listening to the broadcast of Navy's victory over Army 8 days earlier. Yes, I did not forget what happens this Saturday. Displaying a football player's pugnacity, he defiantly fired a .45 pistol at the enemy attackers, his family climbing under their house on Ford Island for shelter. As sailors on board ships and ashore defiantly fought back, aircraft launched from the aircraft carrier Enterprise, returning from delivering a Marine squadron to Wake Atoll, arrived overhead. They saw air activity that was unusual for a Sunday morning, with some of them quickly coming to the realization that the enemy was in the skies, as a Zero fighter made gunnery runs on them. To add to the danger, as some of the planes attempted to land, they were forced to do so amid friendly anti-aircraft fire. Making their approach to Ford Island, Ensign Walter Willis and his wingman, Lieutenant Junior Grade Frank A. Patriarca, noticed smoke rising from Pearl Harbor, and they altered their course to one that took them along the southern coast of Oahu. Suddenly, the two planes were attacked by Zero fighters, which made firing passes on them from above and behind. In the rear seat of Patriarca's aircraft sat Radioman First Class Joseph DeLuca. An experienced gunner, he managed to unhouse his .30 caliber machine gun. In Willis's aircraft was the squadron master-at-arms, Coxswain Fred DeColin, who had no such experience and was primarily a passenger expecting an uneventful flight and an early liberty. As the Japanese planes attacked, Patriarca put his Dauntless dive bomber into a steep dive and eventually shook his pursuers. He never saw Willis and his aircraft again. All told, of the 18 Dauntless dive bombers that launched that fateful morning, 1 was shot down by friendly fire and 5 others fell to Japanese aircraft. Not until December 22nd would a telegram arrive at 140 8th Avenue Northeast in Minneapolis, Minnesota, informing Mrs. Marie Willis that her son was missing in action. 4 days later, a personal letter from Rear Admiral John H. Towers, Naval Aviator No. 3, arrived, this one bearing news that her son's status had been changed to killed in action. The name Willis would carry on in the war that claimed his life. On December 10, 1943, a destroyer escort, Willis, was placed in commission in Houston, Texas, one of many ships that carried the names of someone killed in action at Pearl Harbor. She hunted U-boats in the Atlantic and was transferred to the Pacific Theater after the German surrender, arriving at Pearl Harbor on August 7, 1945, 44 months to the day that her namesake flew into the midst of the first shots of America's Second World War, and a day after the first of 2 atomic bombs that would bring it to conclusion fell from the belly of Enola Gay. 17 days after the attack, a lone PB-2Y Coronado flying boat took off carrying a steely-eyed Texan to his new command. Arriving over Pearl Harbor on Christmas Day, Admiral Chester W. Nimitz made his way into the cockpit and had his first look at the shattered fleet of which he would soon assume command. Earlier that year, Nimitz had been offered the post of Commander-in-Chief, United States Fleet, but he had declined, not wanting to jump over officers who were more senior to him. The post instead went to Admiral Husband E. Kimmel. On the day Kimmel assumed command, a fleet reorganization created the Atlantic Fleet under Admiral Ernest J. King and the Pacific Fleet under Kimmel. The Commander-in-Chief United States Fleet titled Passing Between the Fleet Commanders. Thus, it may have been Nimitz and not Kimmel on the scene at Pearl Harbor on the morning of December 7th. As he looked out over the harbor, Nimitz surely noted that the submarine base, which earlier in his career he had been instrumental in building, was unharmed. He already knew that his former flagship, when he served as Commander Battleship Division 1, USS Arizona, was at the bottom of Pearl Harbor, with much of her crew entombed inside. Among those killed was Rear Admiral Isaac Kidd, whose own flagship as Commander Battleship Division 1 was Arizona. He had been aboard when the Japanese attack occurred, and during the subsequent salvage efforts on the ship, divers would discover his Naval Academy class ring fused to the wreckage of the bridge by the heat of the explosion that sank the battleship. Nimitz's assumption of command on the deck of a submarine, USS Grayling, occurred on December 31st. It was a symbolic venue, for Nimitz wore the dolphins of a submariner on his dress whites, and over the course of the ensuing years, the boats of the silent service would carry the war to the enemy at a level disproportionate to the size of the force. A great amount of natural resources, the necessity for which had been a prime factor in the decision to strike Pearl Harbor so that areas in Southeast Asia could be conquered, would never reach Japan as a result of the decimation of the nation's merchant marine by U.S. submarines. Warships and troop transports seeking to check U.S. advances in the Pacific would also fall victim to the undersea hunters. Nimitz would also have at his disposal the platform of carrier air power. The Imperial Japanese Navy's attack on Pearl Harbor, combined with the Royal Navy's carrier strikes against the Italian fleet at Taranto, and the disabling of the German battleship Bismarck by British torpedo planes in May 1941, demonstrated in actual combat the capabilities of carrier aviation that had played out on pre-war wargaming boards and in fleet exercises. Yet the scale on which sea-based aviation would fight the Pacific War was beyond comprehension in December 1941. A decisive fleet engagement on the order of Tsushima became a series of bitter sea battles with names etched into history: Coral Sea, Midway, Santa Cruz, Leyte Gulf. Additionally, the carriers which in pre-war assessments were thought to be vulnerable to land-based aviation roamed the Pacific, their aircraft neutralizing enemy air power on island bases and directly supporting a two-pronged amphibious assault, along with the hundreds of surface combatants, transports, and landing craft that put to sea. Thus, the relatively brief conflict for which Japan had hoped the thunder strikes of attacks against Pearl Harbor and other areas throughout the Pacific instead became a war of attrition. This was true materially. Consider the fact that on the morning of December 7th, as explosions reverberated along Battleship Row, 10 new battleships were under construction in American shipyards, including Missouri, on whose deck Japan would surrender in 1945. Grumman Aircraft Engineering Corporation opened a new factory that Sunday, showing off for the first time to the public their TBF torpedo bomber. The events at Pearl Harbor would inspire the aircraft's nickname, Avenger. Thousands would be built, and among those who flew them would be future President of the United States, George H.W. Bush. This was also true in the human dimension of warfare. For example, when the aircraft carrier Enterprise, which had as I previously mentioned, had been out to sea when the Japanese attacked, pulled into the oil-soaked waters of Pearl Harbor on December 8th to refuel and replenish under the cover of darkness. A pilot in the embarked fighting squadron 6 joined others in addressing a form postcard to his parents, checking the box that he was okay and would write as soon as possible. In the ensuing months, Ensign Tom Provost participated in the early hit-and-run raids against Japanese installations and also flew at the Battle of Midway. He spent a lengthy period of time ashore, serving as a flight instructor, imparting his knowledge on the nearly 60,000 naval aviators designated during World War II. He then returned to the front lines flying F-6F Hellcats from the carrier Wasp during 1944 and 1945. Few of the Japanese pilots that launched on the morning of December 7th. As a group, some of the most skilled carrier aviators in the world, owing to their lengthy training as a unit and combat experience in China, survived the gauntlet of the Pacific air battles to do the same. The numbers simply did not allow for a regular rotation back to Japan. The Pacific War was a total war, and the tone was set beginning on December 8th with the words spoken by Franklin D. Roosevelt. The original typewritten draft of his speech called December 7th a date which will live in world history. Roosevelt replaced world history with infamy. This characterization of the attack fueling a fervor about the campaigns in the Pacific theater that were distinctly more personal and emotional than that felt towards Germany. The result was combat on a brutal scale, culminating with the most devastating weapons ever unleashed. For the 131 million Americans alive on December 7th, life changed that day. Some became instant Gold Star families, flags in their windows noting that they had lost a family member in the war. A naval aviation cadet, William Prescott, would write home to his family from flight training at NAS Pensacola. A change has occurred here. It was Sunday, one of those bright, snappy, sunny Sundays, and a group of us had determined to go into town for the afternoon and evening. They were gathered in my room, waiting for my transformation into civvies. The usual banter and bull was being tossed around. A cadet ran into the room. "Hear the news, fellows. Pearl Harbor has been bombed." We laughed. Okay, what's the gag? But a look on his face foretold what we were to find on the radio when it was hurriedly switched on. There was shocked silence, and for several minutes the only sound was the announcer's voice bringing up the tragic news. Lee Potter's hand shook as he lit a cigarette. "Looks like this is it," he said. As the details of the tremendous fiasco reached us, we stood with heads bowed in chagrin but defiance. Tears were in the eyes of some. How had it happened? Why had they let it happen? But those questions were for the Navy boards of inquiry and the historians. We went into town that night. The faces of my friends were very changed. I realized then what this strenuous training we'd undergone was meaning to them now. They were older faces, lined and tired, but deadly serious, each realizing the situation in all of its aspects. Was this the Navy of John Paul Jones and David Farragut? It must be. I am waiting for my orders. They will probably take me to the Pacific battleground and within a month. The realities of the day struck a chord later in the month, the first wartime Christmas. Ensign Irvin McPherson, a pilot in Torpedo Squadron 6 on board Enterprise, recorded these words in a diary he was illicitly keeping. "As far as the ship is concerned, this day is the same as any other day. Only in the minds of each man is there a difference according to his beliefs and philosophy. War can't take a man's thoughts away, at least. Sitting here in the ready room this morning, I have been reliving our first Christmas as man and wife. We are living in the present today, and today is as dark as yesterday was light. My prayer is that we will be together next Christmas and forever after. That is all I ask of life." His prayer would come true, but not before carrier strikes against the Japanese fleet at Midway decimated his squadron. The events of 75 years ago shaped not only the course of World War, but the decades to follow. Since that fateful day, the United States has assumed an enduring central role on the world stage that has not diminished. Some of the signature events of American foreign policy taking place in the Far East, including the Cold War battlegrounds of Korea and Vietnam, areas occupied by the Japanese before and during World War II. In the case of the latter, U.S. aviators logged combat missions over what was then called French Indochina during World War II, flying from the carriers with names like Ticonderoga and Hancock, ships that also struck as part of Operation Rolling Thunder 2 decades later, launching jet aircraft. That commitment to the Pacific Rim endures, as an area of key strategic interest, with the military resources of the nation built to guard and defend it. This call to national preparedness is a direct result of the events of that Sunday morning, the name Pearl Harbor invoked for over 7 decades as the bellwether of fates that befall nations unprepared for war. In this effort, an enemy has become an ally. The nation of Japan, a vital partner in preserving peace in areas that were scenes of such bitter combat actions between our two nations during World War II. There exists also a kinship among the people of the two countries, one enhanced in many respects by the positive interaction with generations of U.S. military personnel that have served in Japan. These feelings of mutual respect and appreciation are at their best in times of need, notably the earthquake and tsunami relief of 2011, which is the latest in a series of such efforts. One other one occurred in December of 1958, when ships of the U.S. 7th Fleet received word of a devastating fire that had destroyed 75% of a Japanese city. In just 19 hours, the carrier Yorktown, a veteran of World War II actions, and her escorts were on scene to provide relief in the form of food, medical supplies, and tents. The officer commanding the task group was Rear Admiral Edward Colstock, the same lieutenant who had raced from his home after kissing his wife goodbye as Japanese planes attacked the Naval Air Station at Kaneohe. Later, he would serve here at Newport as the Chief of Staff to the President of the Naval War College. The number of people alive on December 7th, 1941, dwindles by the day. The generations following them defined by their own significant moment, as towers fell and the Pentagon burned. Yet just as we hold on to those memories of a crisp September day, we must ensure that what happened 75 years ago today is never forgotten. The droplets of oil that still leak from the shattered hull of the Arizona, akin to tears of a nation for those who lost their lives one Sunday morning. Thank you very much. Well, if anybody would have any questions, I'll do my best to answer, but a little intimidated with all these fellow professors in here and bright students I've met. So. Yes, sir.
Could you tell us about Nimitz's reaction when he first toured Pearl Harbor after arriving in December?
Well, I cited the story of that PB-2Y Coronado, and I was very fortunate to know the co-pilot on that flight. He actually lived in Pensacola. His name was Frank DiLorenzo, and he was a young ensign, and he was called to man up on that PB-2Y Coronado and take a long trip. And he remembered Nimitz being very gracious, and when they landed, telling all the crew, "I'm very sorry to take you away from your families on Christmas to get me out here." But I think from what I've read about Nimitz, certainly he was shocked by what he saw, sickened by what he saw. But I think Nimitz, he was out there for a reason. He was one of those, he was an officer, obviously, that had something that the leaders saw in him. And so I think he saw opportunity. He saw that the vital fuel storage tanks had not been hit. And certainly with the submarine pens, the subs that he was very much familiar with. So I think he saw promise in what he had out there. But I think he also, as Nimitz, I think as was his characteristic during all of his command during the Pacific War, he liked to take in a lot of information. He was one of those officers that I've read would gather around his staff, and he sought everybody's input. And I think he did the same that morning and looked and saw and got opinions on what was going on and got a view of the strategic situation. And he was out there to do a job, and Roosevelt had personally said, go out there and take care of it, and don't come back until you do. So I think he hit the ground running, ready to go. Yes, sir.
The fuel depot wasn't on their target list. Why did they just forget to bomb it, or?
I think it was The absolute, I mean, there was a lack of a third wave that never went in, and which probably with the lack of any sort of force going out to strike the carriers there could have conceivably launched. But, and that's where I think that Pearl Harbor, there's the famous book, At Dawn We Slept, and the commanding officer of our parent command, Rear Admiral Sam Cox, an intelligence officer, he's the director of Naval History and Heritage Command for whom I work, has written some good stuff lately, and he talks about At Dawn We Slept gives the impression that everybody was just, you know, having drinks on the beach in Waikiki or something. So it was not the case. I mean, USS Ward had sunk the Japanese submarine off the entrance to Pearl Harbor, and though the attack came very swiftly, the spirited defense that those sailors who knew their jobs and, although caught unexpectedly with an air attack, manned their guns, manned their stations, and put up a pretty vigorous defense, more so than I'd say the Japanese probably expected. And that prevented them from striking probably more than they should, striking to a level they could have to inflict more damage. Yes, sir.
What do you think about the efforts to rehabilitate Admiral Kimmel and General Short?
Well, I would say that you have to look at the full body of evidence, and I think there were quick judgments made. And I look at an example which would be the one for Captain Charles McVeigh with the Indianapolis, and you look at the efforts and the long effort that it took to exonerate him from the just for the failure to zigzag and being the only captain to be court-martialed for losing his ship. And so I think the efforts, as long as you look at the body of evidence and if we determine what warnings that they got or they received, and that's what we do as historians, and that's what we do, just like the Naval Aviation Cadet so eloquently stated in his letter. You know, that's for the boards of inquiry and the historians to determine. And so I'm all in favor of looking at all the evidence to determine whether he and Short were unfairly treated. But then again, you look at the Navy. I mean, the Navy is, in all military services, that is the burden of command. Yes, sir.
I wonder if you can have some historical facts on what led the Japanese, who were most likely well aware of the dangers of the attack that they had in 1941. What was it that the United States did or caused to get them so upset and take those risks? Since the Treaty of Versailles, I think, took place after the World War I. And in that whole period, what was it specifically? Must have taken quite a long time for the United States to do something that led them to this attack.
Well, certainly it was the long-standing actions occurring in China, and it was a lot of events that led up to Pearl Harbor, but mainly it was, I would say, the lack of natural resources that Japan had, and the embargoes that were placed on raw materials, oil, going into Japan. It really, in the Japanese mind, the Japanese strategists and tacticians forced their hand because there was really only a certain amount of those raw materials that they could employ, and before they would not be able to do anything. So I think that's what drove their attack most, is to cripple the Pacific Fleet and be able to conquer areas in those vital areas where they could draw those resources to continue their efforts of the greater Co-East Asia prosperity sphere there in the Far East. Are there any other questions? Well, thank you again. It's been a great pleasure being here.
What an extraordinary evening, and I thank you all for coming. Such a powerful and moving presentation. I'm reminded of the power of history as Hill described it, that events aren't simply things that happen. that events are things that people choose to do, and some unfortunate decisions lead to war. And it's a reminder of the need for readiness, specifically called out to each and every one of our great students, that we must be emotionally, physically, and spiritually prepared for uncertain events that may come. I also found it to be a message of hope. And although those who have gone before paid the ultimate sacrifice, we look at this most powerful and strongest alliance that we have today, a tribute to you as Americans, your ability to forgive, your ability to create a new world based on international law and freedoms. And it's truly extraordinary how just one generation later, the strongest alliance in the world is with that nation of that day of infamy. We thank you all for your participation here tonight. We thank especially Hill Goodspeed for his presentation tonight. Please join me in one more round of applause.
Thank you very much. Okay.